God, thank you for today. Thank you for everyone here. I pray that you're just guiding us, our conversations. I pray that we are training our minds for you, God, so we can learn more about you, share more about you, Lord. Just give good defenses for our faith. Jesus, we love you, and I pray that you just are sustaining us, especially me, because I didn't get enough coffee, so that'd be cool. But we love you, Lord, and we praise in your name. Amen. Okay, so today I don't have notes. I did something really scary, and hey, Justin, come on in. Called an audible. I had planned to do morality, kind of part two, like a second side of it. Last week we talked about the morality argument, which is basically when we're talking about the question, if there's good or God is good, why is there evil? And it goes through the progression. Okay, well, if there's evil, you admit there's good. If you admit there's good, you're admitting that there's a moral law, which is assuming a transcendence rather than relative, dependent upon each person. And if you assume a moral law, you're assuming the moral law giver. So that was kind of last week. This week I was going to talk about something called an ethical vacuum, which I kind of stole from C.S. Lewis, which is basically nobody sits in this like unbiased, like level field, this clean slate where they look at all the different worldviews or religions and beliefs and then just like rate them and go, nope, that's not good enough, this is okay, and then like pulls it in and gets the best one. It gets a little crazy, but I decided to not talk about that. So instead, I'll show you if you're like, well, that sounds kind of interesting, I want to know more. C.S. Lewis has let me write this. C.S. Lewis has a short essay called On Ethics, if you want to check it out. It should be, I believe it's in my resources list on the books. So Christian Reflections right here. On Ethics is the actual essay on that book. I believe it's in God on the Docks as well. There's two books, and what they are, they're both by C.S. Lewis, but they're a collection of essays. So it's just, each chapter is a different essay by him regarding something different. So it doesn't read like a normal book, because each chapter is just, it's a totally separate essay. But this specific one, which I know for sure is in Christian Reflections, talks about this. If you've ever read C.S. Lewis, you know his brain is like massive, incredibly smart person. If you haven't read Mere Christianity, he talks about the morality argument in Mere Christianity, so that would be my first thing I'd say before you do this. Read that first. I think it's a little bit easier to read. This one is like weighty. It's one of those where it's like I have to read it for a paragraph and then just stop and go like, what? And then read the other paragraph and then stop and go, whoa. It's one of those. I just have to mull over and over just to get what he's saying. So hopefully you're smarter than me. I pray that's true. We'd all be better off if you were. But anyway, check this out. It's a really, really good essay if you want to read it. What I'm going to do today, and this is why there's no notes, so I apologize for that, is just talk about something I had kind of was undecided whether I was going to teach it or not. And I was like, well, maybe I'll save it to the very end and maybe throw one off. But instead, at the last second, I decided to do it today with no notes, so it's all coming from my head. So if it's like, just be like, Rob, stop, shut up, slow down real quick, or tell me if you have a question, because I'm going to try and wing it, which is never good for me. But this is the resurrection theory. And there's a guy I want to point to. If you haven't already picked up the resources list or don't know, there's a guy by the name of Gary Habermas, or Habermas, one of those. He is a professor at Talbot School of Theology in California, and he is the foremost expert on the resurrection historically. And by foremost, I believe saying the entire world is correct. Like, he's the leading scholar on that. Really awesome guy. Definitely check him out. He is kind of the guy who I'm going to take all this from. Now, there's other things I'm kind of borrowing from. There's different studies, just a couple of different areas where he gets some information from some other people, and I kind of do the same. But by and large, make sure you check him out. You can read his book. I believe it's Did the Resurrection Happen? Is the one I put. He has a couple of ones. Let me make sure I'm saying this right. The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, sorry. So that's one of his books, really good. What he does is this. He went and read thousands and thousands of essays, articles, books, and compiled all of them and said, okay, here's what they say happen. This is what they all have in common. He kind of can't talk today, cross-referenced all of them. But this is big because he didn't just take Christians that were writing these. It wasn't just like historical, Christians who were like, oh, this is how we know Jesus. He took skeptics, he took atheists, he took people who didn't believe in Jesus, and they were still historians, and said, okay, here's even what they say. They will say, okay, this happened. And he made this list, and he argues for the resurrection. And this is what he kind of does, and this is what I'm going to focus on. He says, let's just take the resurrection of Jesus. So throw out the Old Testament, throw out the New Testament. I don't mean that literally, but he just says we're not going to focus on anything else except the resurrection. He's throw out science, philosophy, all that. We're just going to look at this one event. Because if Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, and we can prove that historically, then that means he was God, which means it validates all the New Testament, which Jesus validates all the Old Testament in the New Testament, so that validates the Old Testament too. So that's the Bible, and if the Bible is true and Jesus is in fact God, then everything it says about the world, which would be science, philosophy, everything else, will come from that, which is a pretty big deal, and it's a cool argument. This is a historical argument, though, and if you remember going back the first week, I said I generally don't like historical arguments because there's a lot of debate. It's not my forte, and the three pillars that we have for philosophy, not philosophy, but for apologetics are philosophy is the first one. Then we have science, so there's arguments from scientific evidence, scientific data, and then history, or historical arguments. This one is a historical argument, but I kind of like it, which is odd for me because like I've said, I don't really like history. And the reason is history they'll have a discovery. They'll find something in a dig, or they'll find, inside a cave, they'll see a writing. They'll find something new, and they'll say, whoa, look at this discovery. This must mean this. And then you have someone on the other side that goes, no, actually, I think it means something completely different. But they're looking at the same thing. It's the same discovery. The discovery hasn't changed. The artifact, the drawing, whatever it may be, is the same, but you have differing views. And then, to top it off and make it worse, sometimes we'll discover something in history and say, well, we know this because of blah, 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 X, Y, Z. But then you'll come over and science will have some new discovery. They'll say, oh, well, we found this out about carbon dating, or, this sedimentary layer is actually a little bit different than we previously thought, and they'll have this discovery. And then that'll come over, and that'll kind of change what this means historically, and they'll say, oh, okay, this means this again, and then science will come out with something different, and they'll go, and it turns into this crazy, I can't keep track of it. I'm not smart enough. I don't have time to read every scientific journal, historical journal that pops up with these new discoveries. And that's why I generally like philosophy, because it's a first study, which means it looks at how do we know what we know, why do we know what we know, can we trust what we know? You're fine, come on in. And that's why I generally tend to stay in philosophy, because it hits towards the main point, which is, did God exist? Is the existence of God plausible? Is the non-existence of God plausible? Which, when you come to this stuff, you start arguing on these peripheral points, these points that are kind of outside, that are you get distracted a lot more with this stuff, just trying to prove one point. And that's why I favor this, but this particular theory does a really good job at kind of bypassing some of this craziness, and that's why I personally like it. So let me show you some of the basics of how this argument goes, what he says. Again, I'm doing this all from memory, so chances are there'll be a couple of points that he may say or you'll read in the book that I don't talk about or cover, and that's okay, hopefully. He says this, looking at theologians who are, historians as well, and they're studying the data, even looking at skeptics, atheistic, historians who are looking at data and documents, will say this: Jesus existed. And he lived in Israel or the area of Galilee. That's where he did his main ministry. They can say that. I'm going to take a quick break because this is kind of a big deal. A lot of people, and I've heard this, I've seen it written on forums, I've seen people saying this, I've seen them argue it. They'll say, well, we can't prove Jesus existed. Jesus never really existed. He made it up. By and large, 90%, if you take an actual bona fide, qualified historian, who looks at the data, who, looks at all the historical facts, they will say Jesus at least existed. Now, they're not saying Jesus was God, Jesus did miracles. They're just saying we at least know that during this time from about 0 to 33 AD, Jesus existed in Israel and Galilee. And that's a pretty big deal. So my first thing is this. Don't let anybody say Jesus never existed, because they're actually arguing against the majority of historical fact. And in fact, I've heard we have more evidence to support the existence of Jesus than we do George Washington. But nobody has ever was like, no, that dude didn't exist. No one says that. But we have enough evidence outside of just the Bible saying Jesus did this, to support and go, okay, you know what? There was a man named Jesus who existed in the area of Galilee and Israel during this time. Big deal. The other thing they'll say is we know that he was executed by the Romans, or crucified is what we say. Executed is actually what happened. Crucified is more of how it happened. It was the particular way. So it'd be like saying he got the electric chair in modern times by the Romans. And this is a pretty big deal as well. And we'll talk about this in just a second. But knowing why he was executed, knowing how he was executed and by whom, helps us know historically some of the methods that they would have used, which helps us kind of debunk some arguments against, well, he was just doing this or this or this. We know this too. They'll say there was no body found. And that is a big deal. Now, they're not saying he rose, he walked out of the tomb, but they're saying there was no body. And that's really easy to concede if someone's like, well, we don't know that. We do, because if the disciples are running around going, he rose from the dead, that's all it would have took for them to go, nope, you're wrong, because they would have just opened up the tomb and said, ta-da, you're an idiot. That's basically it. So we know that there was no body found, because if there was, we wouldn't be sitting here today. And the other thing that we know is that the apostles, the disciples, whatever word you want to use, they radically changed over a period of time. And these are the basic ones that even someone who is a skeptic, who's just going to look at some of the historical facts, can concede all these points fairly well. And the only person I know, or the only group belief that I know off the top of my head right now that may argue this is, I believe the Quran says Jesus was never crucified. They say he never died in that manner. But we have enough historical evidence to support that he was killed. He was executed. And so I'm not sure why they say that. I don't know enough about Islam or that belief to really go into depth in that. But I do believe that they, in the Quran, say he wasn't killed. He just kind of went somewhere or something like that, I believe. Don't quote me on that. Oh, it's on video. Ignore everything I said. There we go. Whatever. Let me talk about a couple theories I just want to hit, because you'll hear these are pretty popular against the resurrection. They'll say, okay, yes, he existed. Yes, he lived in Galilee. We know he was killed by the Romans. There was no body found. And we know that the disciples at some point had this radical change about them. But they'll say, here's what happened. One is the swoon theory. And the other one is, they'll say, well, the stolen body. The disciples stole the body, obviously. Someone took it. I'm going to hit the swoon theory first. The swoon theory says, okay, he was executed and there was no body found, but what we think happened was he was so physically, he was so physically beat up, and we know that. Just the nature of crucifixion would tell us that anyone who gets crucified is physically under incredible stress and torment, and they'll say he was so much so that he passed out. He went into a near-death state, and they buried him thinking him to be dead, but he was actually swooned, passed out in this near-death state. And a couple days later, he comes to miraculously and kind of gets out wanders out of the tomb, goes away, dies somewhere else, whatever. And that, I feel that it's still kind of prevalent. I hear this a lot, but by and large, it's really easy to disprove, which is why it still is weird to me that it's still thrown out as much as it is. Here's why. We know that he was executed, crucified was the way they did it by the Romans. During the time of Jesus, Rome is in control of pretty much most of the world as we know it at the time. They had a huge, huge empire. Rome implemented this thing called the Pax Romana, which is Latin for the peace of Rome. Sounds really nice. You're like, oh, the peace of Rome, that's lovely. It was horrible. Here's what they did. If anyone was thinking about insurrection, they wanted to rise up, overthrow the rule of Rome in any area, basically their Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, was a thing that said, we will go in and crush you, destroy you. Remember, the Romans are the leading military in the entire world. They're the most highly best trained killers in the world at the time. They're I almost said mafia. Definitely not the right word. Their army, there we go. That makes way more sense. I told you I need more coffee today. Their army would go in, and if there was a hint, this guy is leading a rebellion, they're thinking of overthrowing Rome, they would come in and wipe them out, kill every last man. Crucifixion was kind of invented by them as an extremely humiliating and painful way to die to discourage people from wanting to break the law or wanting to break the peace of Rome. And we know enough about this to kind of see into how Jesus would have been treated, how he would have been killed. So we know when they come in and they go to crucify Jesus, basically the Jews are going, this guy is wanting to overthrow Rome. He's talking about a kingdom. Remember when he's talking to Pilate in the Bible and they're going, are you a king? Are you king of the Jews? Because he's saying, are you trying to overtake? Are you messing with this? Are you trying to, insurrect, throw a rebellion, basically? And so that's how he dies. Here's what we know about crucifixion. Horrible. They did usually beat victims. Here's what we know about the whips, too. The whips, whips hurt, but it's not just a normal whip we think about. We have some of these. We found some. They would put metal, glass, bone, things in the whip that would, literally, it was just meant to tear flesh off. So it would hit your back, and they'd rip it off, and they'd be ripping off pieces with it. So it wasn't just like ow, you whipped me. It was like, ow, there went half of my back with that whip. Terrible, terrible process. We know that. We know that the crucifixion itself, they had guys who volunteered to be crucified, not for real, not like we're going to nail you, but they would tie them up to a cross. And here's what they found. Most people tied up to a cross passed out within 10 minutes, just being with ropes. Here's why. Because when you put yourself in this position, all your weight hangs. Your chest can't expand like it needs to. Your rib cage kind of gets stuck in this position. So you actually basically choke to death almost. You pass out because you can't breathe, because you can't get the air that you need. And so about after 10 minutes of this position, you swoon or you pass out. Now here's the thing. That's just ropes. And what they would do is the reason when they would crucify you, they would put a nail, probably not in your hand like we normally think, but right here, because your hand bones aren't as strong as your, I'm not a doctor, whatever these bones are. Someone help, anyone know what these are? Radial or something? Yeah. Whatever these things and these are, yeah. They would put them in between because they're stronger, and so it would kind of hold like this. Now what happened is you'd be hanging from, so bleeding profusely just from the nails alone, let alone the back stuff that had already been going on prior to being hung up. And the reason they put a nail in your feet is because to get air, you have to push yourself up from this position. So you hang like this until you're about to pass out and then push up for air. And the reason people die usually on the cross is they get too tired, they bleed out, and they're no longer able to push themselves up to get air. So here's the thing you got to remember. Saying, well, he just passed out. Did people pass out on the cross? Yeah, all the time. They usually passed out and then kind of drowned to death because they would have internal bleeding. It's kind of ridiculous to go, nobody noticed Jesus was dead. Here's why. Remember the biblical account, what all the guards did, the Roman guards did? They broke the legs, right? They went and broke the legs because then people can't stand up to breathe. So they just said, all right, we're going to hurry up the process because the Sabbath is coming. So they break their legs, they get to Jesus, and he's already gone. So they stabbed him, right? Now, some people go, oh, that's the Bible, you can't trust that. We know they at least would break legs to hurry up the process if they wanted to speed up these guys dying. Here's the thing. They crucified people pretty often. You got the most highly trained killers in the known world at the time. They were used to crucifying people. They were probably used to seeing people who had just passed out from not being able to breathe anymore. So these guys weren't just like idiots bumbling around. Like, they would be able to identify a passed out person versus a not passed out person. They had ways to check. Yes, this person is dead. So to say he just passed out is kind of dumb, because you're kind of insulting the Romans, and we know enough about their culture to go, they would have known this dude was just passed out if that's really what happened. And now you have to take into account the bleeding. So your back's already getting ripped up, crazy amounts of blood. You're getting stabbed in both wrists, stabbed through the feet. If the crown of thorns is true, that's not that much, but it's enough that we know, like medically, he probably would have bled out before too long and just died that way. Lack of water going, running through, lack of oxygen. By and large, the chances are he was dead before they ever put him in the tomb. Like, incredibly overwhelming that Jesus died, which would disprove the swoon theory. Now, here's the other thing. Think about a person who has had both feet pierced, both wrists pierced. Maybe they didn't whip him or do anything else. Let's just throw everything out. That's all that happened. Passes out on the cross, hangs there for a good amount of time, at least a couple hours, exhausted beyond belief. So they get him and they go, oh yeah, sure, he's dead. Forget the check, whatever. They're just being lazy. Actually, side note, if you don't know, part of Rome's if you failed, part of their punishment for failing and being a part of their guard was to execute you. So these guys wouldn't have probably been like your mall cop security guards. They're just like, yeah, he's good. Put him on. No, they would have been like, this gets by in the wrong way and we're dead. Our lives are on the line. Probably would not, but let's pretend it did. Let's just throw all that out. They're like, oh yeah, this guy's dead. Sure. They carry him, wrap him up, put him in a tomb. Here's what we know about tombs, at least. The rocks that they put in front were massive, huge. It at least took a couple people to move this thing in place. The swoon theory is like, well, he woke up and walks out. Okay. One, how are you walking on 2 feet that have holes in it? Have you ever tried walking with a sprained ankle? Now you got 2 holes in your feet and holes in your wrists, which would have torn muscles. So, your hands probably aren't working like they should have been. And now you're telling me this dude gets up and pushes a massive stone. And then we got 2 guards. Now remember, these are the highly, most well-trained killers in the world at the time. They had the best military. These guys knew what they were doing. If there are guards outside, this injured person who just woke up from have been passed out for days, presumably, no water, no food, so we've been incredibly weak, holes in hands and feet, is going to take out at least 2 to 3 guys that are experts and have swords? That doesn't make a lot of sense. So the swoon theory is it's dumb, essentially. We'll put it at that. The swoon theory is pretty much by and large disproved just because the evidence of what we know just about Rome, the way that they killed people and what Jesus was killed for, is enough to go, the swoon theory is pretty much garbage. So that's how I feel about swoon theory, if you can't tell. That's the swoon theory. The stolen body theory. This one tends to be the one I feel gets a lot of attention and gets thrown out the most when you start talking about the resurrection. They'll say, okay, yeah, he existed. He was executed. Obviously, they stole the body. He couldn't have walked out. Medically, we can know enough about the human body to go, short of a miracle. They don't want to use that word because then, God. Short of a miracle, there's no way this person, faked death, passed out, walked out of the tomb. So obviously, the disciples came, they stole the body, they make up this crazy, thing. Oh, Jesus rose from the dead, and go on their way. They start spreading it. Here's some of the problems with the stolen body theory. One, talking about the stone. It was large. 2, it was guarded by the Roman guards. We already talked about this. Best military in the world, highly trained. If you remember the account of Peter went to swing a sword and missed a dude's head and just got his ear when they came to take Jesus, right? They weren't killers. They were fishermen and tax collectors. And maybe Simon the Zealot might have been a killer. We're not entirely sure on that. But these guys weren't going to overtake trained soldiers with weapons standing guard over a tomb. It's kind of hard to go like, yeah, these disciples, these lowly, bumbling guys came in and overtook them, overthrew them. And remember, the guards who would probably be executed for failing at their job, overthrew them willy-nilly, goes in, pushes this huge stone aside, takes the body, runs away. No one sees them ever, and they bury it and hide it in a place where no one could ever find the body again. So it goes, and they go and make up the story and then spread the gospel. That would have been extremely, extremely hard for the disciples to do. Really hard. Now, some people go, well, we can't know for sure that there was a guard in front. We don't know exactly, what kind of tomb, if it really did have a huge stone, what size the stone was, how hard it would have been to get in. Okay, let's just say that's true. None of that happened. Okay, let's just pretend. Here's my other thing. The disciples radically changed. That's huge, actually. This may be one of the biggest points in this list. Here's why. Jesus lived presumably between 0 and 33 AD. So we say he died around 33 is generally what most scholars will say. So we know this, in between 33 AD and 70 is when the New Testament was written. So about a 40-year period. Talking about 37 years, you got all the New Testament as we know it. Paul is converted. Peter, James, all the guys, they go out and they start planting churches around Rome and the Western world as we know it, and the gospel spreads like crazy. In between this little 40-year period, we know that the disciples had a radical change because you don't really hear anything about them. You don't hear much about a church, about Christians, about this religion until after Jesus' death. That's when things really explode, right? Here's what's nuts. If the disciples did steal the body, let's say this, no one really dies for a lie. If you know something and you know it's a lie, the disciples, they stole the body, they hid it. They get together, they go, what are we going to do with this? We don't want to give up on this Jesus thing. Let's just make up that he rose and he's God and we'll start our own religion. 2 things. People don't die for a lie. And people who do lie do it for gain, not loss. Right? So now think about this. Every single disciple was executed for talking about this, for preaching this. Paul's got his list. I was shipwrecked, multiple times. I've been beaten countless times. I've been thrown in jail countless times. And then Paul was executed finally by Rome again. Peter was crucified upside down. James was crucified. Stephen was the first martyr. He was stoned to death. We think Thomas, we know, went to India probably and was speared with a javelin, and he died. The only disciple who wasn't killed, quote unquote, was John, and he was exiled to the island of Patmos. So still, not a great way to go. Here, you're old, we're going to put you on an island and just let you die of natural causes without help or people really around. It's not a great way to die. People don't die for a lie. But every single disciple was punished multiple times. They were thrown out of cities. They were beaten. They were flogged. They were put in jail. And you don't see them letting up on this and going, okay. We're sorry. We were just making up the whole thing. They never said that. Because if they had, the church would have died, right? And people lie for gain. But how much did they lose? They lost their families. They lost their homes. They weren't rich. None of them became these big deals, these big, we don't have their big houses where they, built their grand temples. They met in houses. We know that. They met in small areas. They met in secret. Here's the other thing we know. Rome hated the Christians when it was starting up. Hated them. They were persecuted like crazy all around. One, the Jews hated the Christians. They started this in Jerusalem, right? Remember when they had the day of Pentecost? They were all still in Jerusalem just waiting to find out, okay, God, what should we do? So they start preaching this. The Jews hated Christians. They're the ones that got Jesus killed, one, to begin with. And two, Christianity was this really weird cult that was taking their holy word, their scripture, the Bible, the Old Testament that we know now, and changing it and saying that Jesus fulfilled all this stuff and he was the Messiah. And the vast majority of them are going, you guys are nuts. Like, this is not real. The Jews hated them. The Romans hated them. The Romans actually called Christians atheists. Funny, right? They called them atheists because the Greco-Roman gods was what everybody basically believed. And they knew about Judaism was kind of this, smaller sect. But by and large, most people believed in the gods. You got Zeus, Hades, Hermes, all these different gods for basically anything you could think of. And the Christians said, nope, they're not true. There's just one, that's it. And so they called them atheists because they were atheists. They didn't believe in all the gods. They just believed in one God. So the Romans are going, these guys are a really weird cult. They don't believe in the gods. And we actually have transcripts where different leaders in the Roman guard or the army would write to each other talking about mentioning some Christians, and we know they thought that we were cannibals. Because, we're saying weird things like eat the body and drink the blood, and they're going, this has got to stop. These dudes are weird. Who eats flesh and drinks blood? Like, that's weird even for us. So they're going, they got to stop. They're weird, they're cannibals. And they're like incestuous because everyone's brother and sister. They really thought that. It's kind of funny now, but we have documentation where they're going like, these guys are weird, but they don't seem to be harming anyone. Here's what we do know. Rome thought we were so weird that they would make sport of killing us. Christians were rounded up, especially if you look at Roman history, you get through the different Caesars. When you get to Nero, this dude was warped as all get out. He would hang Christians up in his garden and light them on fire, and that's how he would light it up at night. Like he'd use human torches. Christians were rounded up and they were brought to the Colosseum where they would have to fight, trained killers. They would have the animals, the lions, tigers, whatever, and they would just go, there you go. And people would come and watch because it was fun. And these guys were really weird and they needed to be put out. They needed to be stopped. Christians were getting killed left and right. But in spite of all that, the disciples never went, oh, we're just kidding. Give us all your money. Or they never did any of that. Which is really strange because people don't die for a lie and people lie to gain, right? But that went against everything we know. And here's the third thing. How easy would it have been for the disciples to say, Jesus rose spiritually? Forget the body. Jesus spiritually rose. Everything we do is spiritual. Christianity is just spiritual. That's it. So he's in heaven spiritually. He's reigning spiritually. He went down and conquered sin and death spiritually. It'd be easy. You can't point to the body and say he's dead. They go, oh, we know, but spiritually he's alive. How weird is it that they got together and said, let's tell everybody he actually rose physically? Because it's been really, really easy to argue spiritually, right? How do you disprove spiritual? How do you see just spiritual? You can't. It's just taken on faith, right? But they went a really weird direction and just said, he rose physically. Which is unlike any religion to say it was a physical thing that had spiritual ramifications, yes, but it was also a physical resurrection, right? Because it would have just taken a body and they would have been like, no, you're wrong, to say he physically rose. But everything about Christianity hangs on Jesus' physical body rose from the dead, which is a really weird thing to hang on. And if you read the New Testament, some of Philippians, and I know it's in Ephesians a little bit, Paul is actually arguing against something called Gnosticism, which started to become prevalent in this time period, really around the 60s AD again. Gnosticism was kind of almost a sect of Christianity where people were saying Jesus just spiritually rose. He's saying things are just spiritual. The world is divided into a spiritual and a physical. And the spiritual is good, but the physical is bad. And he's saying, no. And if you actually read it, John says this too in, is it 1st or 2nd John? Sorry, I'm blanking on which one, but read through 1st and 2nd John. They're not big books, but in 1st, 2nd John, when he's writing to some of the churches he oversees, he says, how do you know someone has the true Spirit of God? He says, if they believe Jesus physically rose from the dead. If they believe he's God and physically rose from the dead. They keep saying physically rose because there's this weird sect of Christianity called Gnosticism where they're going, it's just spiritual. And all of the disciples, the guys who presumably stole the body, are saying, no, it's physical. There's spiritual stuff going on, but it was a physical thing. Isn't that weird? It's a really weird thing because if I was making a lie for me so that I wouldn't get hunted down and in trouble, I would do it so that, one, I'd probably be getting rich some way or another. But that's not what happened. None of the disciples died rich and wealthy. I would have not died for my lie, so if someone started torturing me and beating me and imprisoning me over and over and over, and that was my life for the remainder as I knew it, I would have gave up a long time ago. And if I was going to make a lie, I'd make it an easy lie to pass instead of just saying it was a physical resurrection. I would have been like, it was spiritual. Just trust me. It happened. You can't see it, but if you pray hard enough or think or, meditate, whatever it is, you'll come to understand the reality of the claim. And no one can disprove it. It's really odd. And that's basically the resurrection argument. There's a little bit more to it. If you want to listen, he has some great debates. He has good books, articles, things like that you can dig further in. There's other things. The Case for the Resurrection is a pretty good book too, if you want to check that out. A lot of things about the resurrection theory. There's a lot of, like I said, you will start getting into the historical facts where it's like science says this and history is here, and they kind of going crazy and interweaving. But by and large, if you take these facts and take what we know about Rome, take what we know about how they crucified, you can basically disprove most of the swoon theories. And we do know for a fact that the disciples had a radical change. And people usually don't radically change over a lie. It's something they believe to be true. So that really disproves the whole disciples stole the body theory. But yeah, so I'll leave it there. It's a little sooner, but like I said, I have no notes, and I'm doing it off the top of my head, so hopefully it all made sense. Are there any questions or anything regarding this? I'll do as much as I can. Like I said, history is not really my forte, but I know a little bit. Yes?
Weren't there over 500 that saw the risen Christ?
Yes, and they say that. Now I'm going to forget which disciple said it, but they said go and ask. I think it's John towards the end of his gospel that says, you can ask them, go, because he appeared to these people and these people. And he's basically saying, these guys are still alive. Check it out. If you don't believe me, try someone else. So, yes, he did appear. But most of that, I try to make this argument from the side of a skeptic. So if you're talking to someone who doesn't believe in any of the gospel accounts or anything, you can say, historians agree on all these points. Here's what this kind of points to, the fact that there was actually not just a swoon, a stolen body, whatever you may have. So, but yes, and that's one of the things I love about the Bible too, is I've never seen another religion that's so rooted in history at the same time and so rooted in facts as well as spirituality. They intermingle. It's not like they don't separate the two and you have these layers where all this stuff is just spiritual and then the rest is whatever. It's all together, which is really neat. I digress, sorry. Is there any other questions? I may not know the answer, especially history stuff. I'm not the best. Good? Oh yeah, they're letting me off easy. Cool. All right. Well, if that's no question, there's that. Next week, let me see I think I planned out some more sort of scientific stuff with the cosmological, I believe. Yeah, so next week is the cosmological argument. The seventh week is the ontological, which was the one I was thinking about replacing with this. So we'll actually do that. It's my least favorite one, but we'll struggle through together. It'll be fun. Maybe you'll like it. That's my point. Like I said, the whole goal of the class isn't to let you be an expert in each thing and then walk out. Like, I hope you feel that way, like you feel way more well-informed than when you came in. But really my ultimate goal was to give you avenues to pursue it further and learn and dive further and get more answers. So that being that, you guys are free. Do as you please.